All right, that's our cue. It's 1:42. Nice to meet you all. Thanks for starting to introduce yourselves in the chat. And again, if you just joined, please feel free to put your name, where you work, and where you're joining us from into the chat. We're going to go ahead and get started. And if more people come in, Brittany will just let them in as they come in. So thanks for coming to this session on advocacy communications. And thanks to the Hawai'i Partnership for organizing the conference today. My name is Ryan Catalani. I work at Family Promise of Hawaii in Honolulu as our executive director. And I'll be giving this presentation on advocacy communications. I hope to reserve maybe 10 minutes or so at the end for Q&A. But if you have questions along the way, feel free to drop it in the chat. If I can address it in the moment, I'll try to. If not, Brittany will help to keep track of any questions that have been answered. So this is what I wish I could give a presentation on, something like 13 weird tricks to be successful with communications. Unfortunately, I cannot. The subject is just too broad to cover in such a short period of time, an hour or less. You might be from a big organization with lots of capacity, or maybe you're the only person at your nonprofit working on this, among a dozen other things. You might be advocating on the state, county, national, or even international level, and your work with the protective factors, might be so varied. So to try and make this as relevant as possible to everyone, the best I can give you all today is 4 things to keep in mind, 4 things to think about as you're designing your advocacy and communications campaigns. Now, I will say I'm totally guilty of not thinking about all of them myself. We're only human and we have limited time and resources, and there are no hard and fast rules. But here are some things that I think everyone would do well to keep in mind to improve our chances for success. Some things might be obvious to you if you're already a communications expert. Hopefully there are a few new things that everyone can pick up. So with that, I'll start with the first one. I think it's really important to be clear about setting your goals and objectives. And, it can be fun to think about communications tactics, right? Like, are we going to use TickTok? Is it going to be a website? How is the communications going to look in the end? But I think taking a step back, thinking about strategy first will pay dividends moving forward. In other words, let's not put the cart before the horse. I think there's a common notion, for example, to simply build brand awareness or, an audience that you own, quote unquote. But to what end? Usually just having an audience isn't the end goal. Usually it's about influence. So when you're thinking about social media, for example, and you think, we want to grow our social media followers. If you go a little bit deeper into that goal and explore what you're really trying to do, maybe you're trying to increase the number of people who know about your organization so you can ask them to testify. Maybe you are trying to ensure that a certain group knows about resources or services or that you're offering. Maybe you're trying to increase the number of donors or get people to change their mind about a certain issue. Social media volume by itself usually isn't the end goal. And I will say, just as a side note, you don't necessarily have to use it. I think there are plenty of successful organizations that don't heavily use social media because they communicate in other ways. When people see that you have something to offer, I think they'll start coming to you organically. In other words, your influence is greater than the number of followers that you might be seeing on your Instagram or Facebook. So I think it's important to look at it holistically. The next thing I would encourage you to do is just take some time to reflect on the past year, the past couple of years, what's worked well. And there are ways to look at these things. There are some great free analytics tools that I'll cover in a little bit. One of those is Google Analytics. So if you're not already using these for your website, it's just a free platform where you can install this little piece of code on your website, and you'll be able to track how many users your website has, which pages they're viewing, and how that's changed over time. And it's a great way to see if your communication strategies over the past year, couple months, have been successful, or at least reaching your goals. All of the major social media platforms do also have analytics platforms built in. So Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, you can see how your posts are performing, which ones got the most views or which ones had the most engagement, and kind of use those to tailor to see, are you really reaching the right type of audience? Do you need to grow your audience in other ways or adapt your content to what they're saying? Also on Facebook in particular, Facebook and Instagram, you can even see some of the audience demographics that they have. So you can see sort of an age and gender and location breakdown for who's currently following your page. And again, this is all free and built in to Facebook and Instagram. You know, there's that old saying that, you can have two of these three things: good, fast, and cheap. And unfortunately, I think the same applies to communications. Even with all of the technology that we have, I think it's still important to be realistic because the eventual tactics, the eventual specific communications or advocacy methods you use may vary depending on how many resources you have toward this. What's your timeline? We're all busy people working at nonprofits, I think many of us, and you need to prioritize. We have limited budgets. You can get some great stuff for free, but as with anything, there's a limit to what you can get for free. Like with social media, if you pay for social media ads, they will simply reach more than if you post something directly to your account. So, you could spend, let's say, 100 hours of your time tracking down followers, or spend $100 to get it to the same number of people. I would say one is not right or wrong. It sort of depends on what your real objective is. Also considering your people. If you're a team of one, you probably can't do as much as places with a huge staff, even though there are some tools that can really help. Maybe there are other places that you can leverage, like volunteers or partner organizations. So working together and collaboratively designing communication strategies can be a good way to get your message out there more. When I used to work at Hawaii Children's Action Network, we did a lot of partnerships with other organizations to kind of share our information with them and vice versa. So if we had a program coming up, we would ask all of our partner organizations to share it as we would for them. You've probably heard of SMART goals also. If you haven't, this is kind of an acronym to create well-defined goals. You can also add, I've seen recently, an IE to the end, so SMART-E goals. And this would stand for not just specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound, but also inclusive and equitable. Basically, this is a way of examining how will you know if you're successful? If you're doing something, how are you going to tell later on if it reached that objective? I think whether eventually you're going to be sending a tweet or sending a press release, I think it's important to start with this sort of concrete goal in mind. So in terms of measurable, maybe it's the number of new email signups, the number of new pieces of testimony. Maybe it's using those analytics that I showed. There are a couple of other platforms. If you have an email provider like MailChimp, you can look at how many people have opened your email or clicked on certain links. We'll talk a little bit more about some other ones later in the presentation. There's also this neat Chrome extension called CrowdTangle, where you can look at any web page and see how many times people have interacted with it online. So if you have a particular landing page or website for your campaign that you're working on, you can see, are people engaging with this and how are they doing so? Plenty of other things to get for free, which always always appeals to me working in nonprofits. One thing I've made heavy use of is this tool called Asana, which is a project management tool. It has a pretty robust free tier and then a 50% discount after that. But I've used it extensively to plan out communications because you can see all of the posts or your campaign elements on a calendar. You can attach images and assign them to different parts to different people on your team. So it's a great way, especially if you're working with others, to make sure everyone is on the same page and knows what needs to get done and plan out your campaign in advance. I've also made great use of Slack. Slack is a sort of group messaging tool for organizations and companies. So it's a little bit faster and more robust, a little bit more organized than emails or texts, but essentially allows you to do the same thing just within your organization. Slack also has some great integrations with other tools like Asana. So on Slack, I had a channel or sort of a group message that was a place where other staff could share things they wanted us to share on our communications channels. So if one employee, had a certain link, a certain resource to share on our email newsletter, they could put it in Slack, and then I would take it from there and put it in Asana for our overall communications calendar. So again, it was just sort of a way of, keeping organized and making sure that we were trying to meet our objectives. So second point, what's the big picture? And by big picture, here's what I mean. Once you've determined your goal, your SMART goal, your SMARTY goal, and your level of resources, you can really start to think about your audience. Who are you trying to reach with your communications or advocacy campaign? What I like to do is really try to develop a mental picture of who I have in mind. Think about where they might live, their age or other demographics, and sort of paint that picture so that when I'm crafting the communications later on, I have this clear sense. It might not just be one person, there might be a couple different target audiences. Maybe it's an intermediary, for example, you're a primarily English-speaking organization and you want to reach older people who speak another language. So maybe you're trying to target the kids of those parents instead. I would encourage you to be, as specific as you can. Rarely are you trying to reach everyone with every single communication or campaign. And this is sort of where it helps to know clearly what your goal is and your level of resources. So, if your goal is to mobilize supporters around an issue, and you don't have too much capacity, too much time, resources to get this out, maybe you're just really targeting partner organizations, people you can partner with to get the word out through their own networks. If you have more capacity, on the other hand, maybe that's when you start to go to people who are most affected by the issue to mobilize around your campaign. As another example, maybe you're trying to persuade the opposition. And if you don't have a lot of capacity, maybe you're just going straight to the decision makers in targeting your communications and advocacy. If you have more capacity, though, maybe that's when you try and reach the everyday people who don't know much about the issue, but might be able to be persuaded. So again, you might have multiple distinct audiences within any of your communications or advocacy campaigns, but they may require multiple distinct messages, and we'll touch on that in a bit too. So in terms of being as specific as you can with this, I'll use an example from Hawaii Children's Action Network, HCAN, where I worked up until about a month ago. So earlier in this legislative session this year, we had two main priorities, which were around childcare and early learning access. And then one was around the earned income tax credit. And we determined that we actually had two very different audiences that we were trying to reach with both of these campaigns. So here's the one on childcare and early learning, for example. On the left, you'll see our messaging that was targeted to sort of the general public. So it was more succinct, it was more emotional, more personal, more use of us. So it says, imagine your life without childcare worries. Imagine not having to worry about finding a slot or how you're going to use it. The legislature has the power to make this happen. You want to give your kids the best possible start in life. It's time to get the excellent childcare you deserve. On the right, you'll see the messaging that we targeted to more legislators and advocates. So with them, we used more detailed, more specific terminology. It was a bit more detached, more abstract or intellectual. So it says, Hawaii is in an early childhood crisis. Every child deserves a strong start in life. But for too many children, their opportunities are limited by where they live and their family's income. Early care and learning programs, also known as childcare, support children and families through critical times in their lives. But Hawaii's current childcare system is not working. In fact, it's designed to fail children, families, and communities. Costs are too high for families, and childcare workers can't earn enough to stay in the industry. So again, you can see how we were able to tailor the messaging later on because we were very clear that we had two very distinct audiences in mind. Similarly, and I won't go into all the details for this, with the Earned Income Tax Credit campaign, on the left for the general public, we just said very simply, do you want a bigger tax refund? And on the right, we had a lot more sort of jargony terms about the Earned Income Tax Credit and sort of its more abstract, quantitative benefits for the community. The next part is just, keeping a steady drumbeat. So whatever your goal, it's probably not going to be accomplished all at once. Only a fraction of your audience will see any message at any given time. As an example, I always think like in your email inbox, you don't open all of your emails, even from all the organizations that you are committed to supporting. So what this means is, to me, that you can be a broken record. That's a good thing. You can keep repeating your message over and over again. Whenever I send out an email newsletter or a social media post or something, I always assume that only a small fraction of our audience is going to see it. So every time I'm just trying to repeat the same core message. People won't find it repetitive. In fact, it'll help to get your message through. And the other component is sort of making sure every slice of this cake has the same layers. In other words, making sure that all the things you're sending out fit within sort of a common brand identity. And that doesn't mean having a fancy logo or anything, although that can help. Knowing what a certain color scheme or set of fonts that you want to use, keeping those consistent visually definitely helps. But to me, it's more about what is your mission and vision, and just in all of your communications, making sure you're always bringing it back to that. Just as a small example, these are a sampling of some of the social media posts we did with HCAN. Actually, HCAN speaks during the 2022 legislative session. So these are on, sort of a variety of things targeted to a variety of audiences, but we were able to keep the same color scheme and fonts and general look and feel. So when people saw these posts, hopefully they still associated them with HCAN Speaks and our legislative campaigns. Okay, messages. So getting to the good part. By messages, I mean, what is the main idea? So it's about distilling what you're trying to say into sort of the core thought, the core sort of main idea for it. And this is where it's important to keep your audience in mind. You might have different messages for different audiences, and they can still be a part of the, the whole bigger picture strategy or goal that you're trying to achieve. So with messages, there are a couple of ways that I like to think about this. One is thinking about the consequences of the metaphors that you use. So there was a 2011 study that tested these two messages. The first was crime is a beast ravaging the city, and the second was crime is a virus ravaging the city. And so they gave these messages to two different groups and asked them what the appropriate response would be. The two choices were to more heavily enforce the law or to treat, quote unquote, the underlying social issues. And so when the test group who saw crime as a beast ravaging the city, they were much more likely to think that the right solution was to enforce the law rather than to treat the underlying social issues. Interestingly, when the other group saw crime as a virus ravaging the city, they had the complete opposite findings, that they're much more likely to see the right solution as treating the underlying social issues. And this was a bigger difference. They found that this difference in the messaging was bigger than all the other potential effects that they studied, including the natural sort of split you would expect between different political groups. There's another professor named Jonathan Haidt who studies something he calls moral foundations theory. And the basic concept is that there are 5 or maybe 6 moral foundations that everyone across the world shares. And that we were sort of our political differences arise out of us, the differences in how we prioritize those moral foundations. And so you can actually take the test yourself online, yourmorals.org. It's kind of fascinating to see how you fit within these 5 moral foundations. Anyway, he found that sort of not just in the US, but around the world, liberals feel very strongly about the principle he calls caring, and conservatives feel very strongly about the ones that he calls loyalty, authority, and sanctity. So there's much more to this, but I think one interesting one of the moral foundations is fairness. And there are actually a couple different ways to think about fairness. So the first one he calls proportionality, which means that people are getting benefits in proportion to their contributions. Nobody is getting cheated or is cheating themselves. In other words, here's an example he used: employees who work the hardest should be paid the most. He writes, if you've ever shared a kitchen with roommates, you know how sensitive people can be about who's doing their fair share and who's the slacker who uses the kitchen a lot, but doesn't do a proportional amount of cleaning and shopping. So he found that pretty much everyone across the political spectrum values this concept of proportionality, but conservatives value it a little bit more. The next type of fairness he calls procedural fairness, which means that honest, open, and impartial rules are used to determine who gets what. And this is encapsulated in the statement: society should make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to proceed. So again, it's something that pretty much everyone agrees with, but you see the opposite trend, that the most liberal people tend to agree with this a little bit more than the most conservative people. And lastly, the last type of fairness he calls equality, fairness in the sense that everyone gets the same thing, or in other words, in this statement, ideally everyone would end up with roughly the same amount of money. And so he finds that only the most liberal people responding to these tests tend to agree with that. And it goes way down from there toward the conservative part of the spectrum. So this just goes to show that even within sort of the concepts that you might take for granted, there are so many ways to think about them and how your audience might respond to them, which is why having your audience defined earlier on is so important, to be able to think about what they might respond to. Here's another example from his book about messaging of tax fairness, quote unquote, tax fairness on the political left and the political right. So on the left, there's tax the wealthy, fair and square. And on the right, fairness means spread my work ethic, not my wealth. You know, these differences are driven by what psychologists call sort of the different systems in our brain. So, you know, Chip and Dan Heath use this metaphor of the elephant and the rider, where our brain is sort of like has these 2 parts. One is the elephant, you know, this big animal, you know, it's going to go where it's going to go. That's our unconscious. That represents our intuition and our emotions that we may not even be aware of. The rider, much smaller, the person on the elephant, is our conscious mind that's responsible for strategic reasoning. And so, you know, what they're saying is that when we see something, first we have an emotional response, you know, and then we sort of, the logical part of our brain kicks in and maybe tries to steer us a different way. Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist also, explores this topic in his book called Thinking Fast and Slow. One interesting experiment I think that illustrates this is that you know, subjects were asked if they would opt for surgery if the survival rate is 90%. That was one group. Another group were told that the mortality rate is 10%. So they're hearing the same thing. The survival rate is 90%. The mortality rate is, the survival rate is 90%. Mortality rate is 10%. It's the same underlying concepts, but the first framing focusing on the survival rate, increased acceptance, even though the situation was no different. They write that our minds are well adapted to providing these post hoc or after the fact explanations for our built-in moral convictions, our intuitions that we already possess. This can seem, of course, counterintuitive because we see ourselves as rational actors who make measured arguments and have thought carefully about things like our political affiliations, our moral convictions, our religious beliefs. But really, there's this unconscious, intuitive, emotional elephant still driving our thoughts. So how do we harness this knowledge of, people's unconscious leading the way? Chip and Dan Heath, again, have another book called Made to Stick, which is about communications and messaging that works. And they say that sticky ideas have these 6 things in common often, which they use the acronym SUCCESS. So it's simplicity, unexpectedness, concreteness, credibility, emotions, and stories. And so by simplicity, they mean finding the essential core of your ideas. And they sort of quote this, maxim from defense lawyers that say, if you argue 10 points, even if each is a good point, when the jurors get back to the jury room, they won't remember any of them. So finding the essential core of the idea makes it stickier, makes it more successful. Unexpectedness. So they don't just mean surprise, they mean finding a way to generate interest and curiosity. So they write, one method is to open gaps in people's knowledge and then fill them, telling people something they didn't know they didn't know. Concreteness. They write that mission statements and visions and strategies are often ambiguous to the point of being meaningless. And I'm sure your organizations do not have ambiguous mission statements, but some do. They write that memory is not a single filing cabinet. It's more like Velcro. So the more hooks an idea has, the better it clings to memory. In terms of credibility, this is about making the audience agree or believe in the idea that you're sharing. So how do we make people believe our ideas? You can't always appeal to a higher authority. We don't always have the ability to, have the Surgeon General or, have this whole book of statistics to back up our ideas. So how do ideas sort of carry their own credentials, their own authority? And here they actually cite Ronald Reagan, and point out that his campaign asked this very simple question. Before you vote, ask yourself if you are better off today than you were 4 years ago. So this idea didn't rely on any external expert, it just relied on yourself, which is the most credible messenger that there could be. In terms of emotions, this is about making the audience care. And they identify 3 main ways that you can try to do this. The first is to create empathy for specific individuals, maybe sharing the story of a powerful story that someone you serve or someone who would be affected by this issue. But they also highlight 2 other very interesting ways, appealing to someone's self-interest, what's in it for me, or appealing to someone's self-identity, what would someone like me do? And these might even be more powerful ways to get your message across. And the last point is stories. And they write, a good story is like a flight simulator for the brain, which puts knowledge into a framework that is more lifelike than just using factual or logical arguments. And for any of you who have worked in communications and shared people's stories, the value and how a good story can get across so much more information than any number of statistics you could cite. So this is what we did with our legislative priorities. Again, the childcare campaign and the earned income tax credit campaign. I'll just walk through a couple of points that we sort of applied the success framework to. So with simplicity, The taglines were, I think, quite straightforward. Imagine your life without childcare worries was one, and then want a bigger tax refund. That's the second one. So, not trying to get a lot of points across, just sort of distilling it to the essential core of those ideas. Unexpectedness. So for the childcare campaign, we wrote, imagine not having to worry about finding a slot or figuring out how to afford it. The legislature has the power to make this happen. And for anyone who's worked or sort of experienced the childcare system, this is our way of, bringing something unexpected to the plate. On the earned income tax credit, the EITC campaign, we told people that many workers could get a bigger tax refund as soon as next year, as if the legislature acts soon. If you have children, you could get an even bigger boost. So again, sort of opening this knowledge gap in people's minds and kind of leaving them to wonder, how could this happen? With credibility, we sort of framed all of these messages around the individual person. So we were sort of looking to appeal to people's own self-interest, and not in a bad way, just that, people are struggling with childcare. People could use a bigger tax refund. And so putting them in the driver's seat of these messaging instead of making it more abstract. And then with the, just to highlight some of the emotional parts, we all want to give our kids the best possible start in life. So appealing to people's self-identity as parents or caregivers. And then on the EITC side, we wrote, it's tough to make ends meet in Hawaii. What could a bigger tax refund do for your family? So again, they didn't need an outside expert to be able to sort of answer these questions for themselves. Lastly, with stories, with both of these campaigns, we paired them with sort of the real life stories of people experiencing this. So for workers who would be eligible for the EITC and would get a bigger tax refund, or with parents who were experiencing childcare shortages and the high costs and low access. Next, you have, just to recap, you've come up with a great goal, you've determined your audience, and you've come up with some messages. So now we can really dive into how do you make your content the most effective it can be. So you've thought about your audience. Now it's the time to think about where they are in terms of where they would be seeing this message. And this is why, I find it helpful to sort of imagine someone, if you have this picture of a particular person, would they be seeing this on TV? Would they be reading this in the Star Advertiser? Would they see this on Twitter? Knowing your audience will help to determine which channels or communications platforms to use. And then thinking about the platforms is helpful because that often determines the type of content you're going to use. So if you, we all have limited time and resources. So you don't want to waste your time or money developing messages for places that they won't resonate. So here are just a couple of things, and this is, I think, kind of a rough approximation from me. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet, right? There's no particular communications platform that is going to be both cheap and easy to do effectively and also have a big audience built in. Unfortunately, they're kind of on an inverse relationship, I tend to find. So you have things like blogs, right? Which, you can go to WordPress.com, set one up for free, and it's very cheap and easy to do, in a really effective way. But it doesn't come in with an audience built in. You're going to have to go out and build that audience yourself. On the other hand, you have things like TV ads or direct mail campaigns, maybe even social media ads. These do come with big audience. You're guaranteed to reach a lot of people, but they're not necessarily the cheapest or easiest to do well. You need to put a lot of more time and resources into them. And then you have sort of things in the middle where like an email newsletter, an op-ed, a letter to the editor. where, you can do these things on a budget, maybe just one person even, but it's not necessarily going to have the same audience unless you build it up yourself or choose wisely. So, you might have multiple combinations of using different messages on different channels. You might consider the lifestyle of a person where, like physically, where they might be most receptive to this post. One thing on Instagram is if you, in those analytics I mentioned, you can actually see the hour of the day that people are most likely to be viewing your Instagram. So you can use all these tools to sort of plan out what are the best platforms to reach people on, and then sort of devise the right type of content to reach them through that platform. You might also consider, are you trying to reach a more elite audience? This is where more maybe an op-ed in Star Advertiser or Civil Beat might work. If you're trying to reach a more, everyday audience, maybe, the TV news stations might work better. And just as a side note, in the lower left quadrant, those are things that are both harder to do and have a smaller audience. Those are things to me like one-on-one meetings or doing like direct grassroots community organizing, right? Very time intensive and deliberately small. If you're not where your audience is yet, I think there are ways to get there. So this was from a Pew study on social media use in the US. And I think it's really interesting to look at because, it sort of shows that social media use is not uniform across demographics, across different walks of life. So overall, there are some platforms that are much more commonly used than others. Platforms like YouTube and Facebook, have 2/3 or more of their US respondents are using them. Whereas platforms like TickTok, Reddit, Nextdoor, again, this is from 2021, less than a quarter or less of their respondents were using those. But if you break it apart a little, then you start to see some interesting things. So among those who have a college degree or higher, actually, they're much more likely to use platforms like LinkedIn, over 50%, compared to those with a high school degree or less. Another big one is Nextdoor, and even platforms like Instagram and Pinterest and Twitter. So, it sort of goes back to knowing who your audience is. If you're trying to reach certain types of people, different social media platforms might be best. Another example is by age. And this probably won't come as a huge surprise. Those aged 18 to 29 are much more likely to be on platforms like Snapchat, TikTok, even Instagram and Reddit than others. Whereas those 65 and up, the only platform that they're using more than the 18 to 29-year-olds is Nextdoor. So good to keep in mind, with the age of your audience. Also looking at it split by income. So those who are making $75,000, whose household income is $75,000 or more, again, much more likely to be on platforms like Twitter and LinkedIn, Reddit and Nextdoor, compared to those making $30,000 or less. So this is just to say that any one social media platform, is not the end all be all. It really just depends on who you're at, having a clear idea of who your audience is and who you're trying to reach with it. So you've come up with your main idea. You've come up, sort of with what platforms you might want to use. What does it look like now? And I have a picture here of a brain. At this place I used to work at, when we were planning out our communications or messaging, we called this the big, beautiful brain, because the more you know about something that's in your big, beautiful brain, the harder it gets to explain it to someone else. Chip and Dan Heath call it the curse of knowledge. And they write, once we know something, we find it hard to imagine what it was like to not know it. So once you know something, it's hard to imagine what it's like to not know that thing. And they cite this experiment where one person, people are paired up together in this experiment, and one person in the pair thinks of a song, like a well-known song, and then taps out the rhythm of that song on the table. The other person has to listen to the tapping and try to guess what the song is. So they asked, before the experiment started, they asked the tappers, how often do you think the listeners will be able to identify the song? And they said, maybe about half the time, 50%. It turned out that it was really only 1 in 40 attempts, and the tappers were really shocked. They thought it was obvious, they're hearing it in their own brain and trying to convey it to someone else. But if you're just listening to these random taps as a listener, it sounds like Morse code. It sounds like gibberish, you never be able to know. So it's really important to be able to sort of get out of your big, beautiful brain and imagine what it's like for someone coming across this knowledge or information for the first time. This really comes back to putting your audience first. First figuring out what you want to say, then thinking about how people will understand it. I often think about how I would describe this idea to a parent or a grandparent, someone who is on our email list and they have limited knowledge and also limited time and interest in trying to understand what I'm trying to say. So as an example, this is adapted from a press release I sent out at HCAN. If we were to write something like this, HCAN is proud to announce the launch of its 5th annual cohort of PLTI, which is now open to participants statewide. I would think, if I didn't know anything about this, I would think, who is HCAN? What is PLTI? Why should I care? And there's nothing I can do about this. I'm just going to move on. That's not how I sent out the press release. This was actually how we sent out the press release. A free training program is now accepting online applications from residents who want the tools and knowledge to make positive changes in their communities. It's much more concrete. It doesn't have all the details, but at least it grabs your attention and it lets you know why you should care right now. The first example is sort of something that would be very easy to write when you're day-to-day working on these programs. You know all the acronyms, you know what they're about, you know what they're trying to say. But taking that step back and thinking about how it's going to resonate to someone who has no idea about it, I think can be really powerful. And by the way, with the press release, this was from a press release. I think it's important to remember that the audience of a press release are reporters, not the people you're ultimately trying to reach. So the audience of a press release are reporters, is a reporter, and reporters are often very busy and will spend little time trying to understand what we're saying. So we have to be really clear and succinct in the press release. One really effective tool for this, not just for press releases, but for, I think, any sort of communications, is the inverted pyramid. This is sort of the opposite of the way we're taught to write in school. In school, we have the 5-paragraph essay, right? The intro, the arguments, and then the conclusion is where you really get your main points across. You tie it all up together. In the inverted pyramid model, you do basically the opposite. You start with the most important stuff at the very top, and then sort of make your way down to less and less important things, so that at the end of whatever you're writing, it's just nice to know stuff. This way, if someone stops after the first sentence, they'll still leave with the most important stuff you want them to know. If they stop reading after the first paragraph, they'll have even more information, but they won't be missing things from later on. Just think about how, well, certainly I consume things nowadays. If you're reading a news article, you might only read the first couple paragraphs and not the end. And so that's why they're often written in this style, the inverted pyramid style, so that you will still have the most important information no matter when you stop reading. And this can be used for anything from social media to email and, of course, press releases. Whenever it's important that you're trying to convey something to an audience and you don't have very much time. So here's an example from an email that we sent out from HCAN Speaks during the legislative session. So we started with the most important stuff at the top of the email. The first sentence says, Senate Bill 2701 has another hearing scheduled on Tuesday, which means it's time to show your support again for this important bill that would improve our childcare system. And then we said it's as easy as clicking support. So in that first paragraph, in the first sentence, really, we got across why we're sending this email to someone and why they should care. Then we gave them very clear instructions on how to submit testimony. And then if they kept scrolling down, we sort of, then at that point, we explained what this bill is all about, how they can learn more about the issues, watch a video or read a news article. By putting those things toward the bottom of the email, it ensured that people wouldn't miss what we're really trying to get them to do, which was submit testimony. But if they kept scrolling, they got to know sort of the nice to know parts of it, the information. If they wanted to take a deeper dive, they could get that information as well. Of course, personal stories are always valuable. You know, people connect on a human level. I've done or been part of trainings about how to share your personal story effectively. But you know, just with anyone, you can think about how are you bringing to light the messages you established earlier. You know, how is this person's story sort of reinforcing the message you've developed earlier? And how are they going to illuminate that to the audience? And you might have multiple stories for each message you've established. Some other tools you might use. I love to use this online platform called Bitly. This lets you create short and memorable and trackable URLs. So instead of having like a long, complicated Google Docs URL, you can sign up for Bitly, it's free, and then make it into something that you can say out loud. So it's really handy. And then you can actually also track how many people are clicking on those links. So I often use it for social media where, you know, you've probably noticed like on Instagram, you can't click on a link on Instagram. So if you have something there that just, you know, instead of this long URL that no one will be able to remember, you have bit.ly link that just says, you know, bit.ly/ you know, 2022 conference. You know, I think someone has a much higher likelihood of being able to type that into their own web browser after seeing it. Here's an example from our legislative campaigns. For all of the bills that we were using, we created these bit.ly short links with SB or HB and then the bill number. So people could just type those in directly and get to the testimony page. QR codes, you know, I would say to use sparingly. Really, they're only good for printed materials. It's not very useful to put a QR code on something that's only being used digitally, especially something that you might see on your phone, like on Instagram, right? Because then you have to have another phone to scan the QR code that you see. I only have one phone, so it doesn't work for me. On printed materials, it's great. So if you need to generate QR codes, one tip is that you can actually create them right in Chrome. So if you click on that little share button in the Chrome address bar, you can generate a QR code without having to go to any other platform to do so. Like I said before, you know, no need to be on every platform. If your audience isn't on TikTok, you know, and you don't have the resources to really invest in creating a robust TikTok presence, just as an example, maybe find an audience that would suit your, find a channel that would suit your audience better. Some design tools. So Canva, many of you may be familiar with, which lets you create, you know, easily create nice looking designs for things like flyers and posts. Canva Pro is actually free for nonprofits. So if you haven't already, I would definitely encourage you to apply for that program. iMovie is also a surprisingly excellent free tool that if you have an iPhone, an iPad, or a Mac, you can get access to some of the most sophisticated video editing, at least for most things that you would probably need to do. Two other tools for social media I like to use are Hootsuite and Buffer. Both of these platforms allow you to schedule out posts in advance so that if you are doing, you know, a communications campaign that lasts multiple days or weeks or months, or if you just want to have a regular presence on social media, you don't have to remember to go to every single platform every single day. You can schedule these out in advance, and then they'll just show up and be posted automatically. Both of them do have free plans, and then they both have discounts for nonprofits if you need more features. There's another cool platform called Headliner, and this lets you take something that's an audio, like a podcast or a radio interview, and make it into a video with an animated waveform that you can share on social media. So, if you did a great interview on HPR, you can take that recording, put it in Headliner, and then make this little video to share on your Instagram. For email, two of the tools I like to use, subjectline.com. So on subjectline.com, you can put in your email subject line, and it'll give you a score between 0 and 100 based on its analysis of different factors from their research on whether or not it's more likely to make someone open the email. There's also monthly writing prompts, and I can share the link for this as well. I have a handout with all of the links I'm talking about here, where they give you writing prompts for emails every month. So like January, for example, is apparently National Mentoring Month. That's the type of thing that they let you know about. And also upcoming pop culture events and movies and shows. Ultimately, whatever platform you end up using, I would just take a little bit of time and look at examples of what works well. I do this all the time, sort of just Google, YouTube best practices, and you'll find out things about the platform that you wouldn't have known or sort of been able to see as just a user of the platform. So things like in Instagram, figuring out how to use those link stickers in the story, in your Instagram story, or, whether you want to have something distributed on a PDF or a web page. Just thinking about the platform best practices can help to ensure the success of your goals. And lastly, just keep experimenting. The nice thing about our communications and advocacy work is that if it's not working, just try something else. Make your best guess as to your goals and your audience and your messages and your content. Use some of those free analytics tools and see if they're working. If it does, great. And if not, there are plenty more things to do out there. So I think there's still a couple more minutes for questions if anyone has any. If not, you can always reach out to me. My email is up there, and I will send out through the platform a list. Well, you can have these slides and then sort of a list of the links to the things I mentioned throughout. So I'll pause here if there are any questions.
Hi, Ryan. I'm trying to see how I can apply, these practices to advisory board and trying to reach out, I guess more for parents, not so much but also looking at like the funding or other resources that can help get this going.
Yeah, for sure. So what type of advisory board is it?
I guess it would be prevent child abuse and neglect.
Okay, yeah.
It's actually it would be for Hawai'i Kaika partners to be able to tap into finding trends and gaps in services and whatnot.
Yeah, great. Well, hopefully, the first place I personally always go in order of those questions. So I definitely always start with the end goal and the audience in mind. So, if you were preparing something for your funders, it would probably look different than something you're preparing for people you want to recruit to the advisory board. So what you articulated there, just having that sense of different audiences is a great, first step to going down the line.
Yeah, I'm hoping that I can use some of these steps to, kind of starting from the bottom and working our way up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, feel free to email me if there's other, if you want to chat further after this too.